So good afternoon, good evening. It's this kind of in-between aperitivo time, so I don't really know what to call it. A very warm welcome to all of you, and it's wonderful to see everybody here. I am Luisa Bierasevich. I'm a professor of European governance at the University of Amsterdam and the co-director of ACES, the Amsterdam Center for European Studies, that is co-sponsoring this event. So a welcome on behalf of ACES, on behalf of myself, on behalf of the Department of European Studies as well. And as I said, it's wonderful to see all of you here because many of the events that we've been organizing in hybrid fashion over the past month, I don't think there's been one with such a large turnout in person. So thanks so much for turning out. So I'm extremely happy to be here, not just in my institutional role, but also because the two books that we will be discussing and celebrating tonight, I don't want to say I saw part of the birth of, but almost. I feel very fortunate to have been in the early stages of their conception. Sorry, all these reproductive metaphors are coming to my mind. I don't know, it must be the springtime. But it's wonderful to see them in book form and to have the chance to have this double book launch tonight. So I don't want to take too much time because I think we have a very interesting program. So what we will do is we will have the two authors present the book, starting with Özge Calafato and then on to Enno Maessen. They will speak for about 10 minutes each. We will then turn over the floor to our colleague Hido Snell, who will act as discussant and start with some questions to them. After they've had a chance to respond, we will open the floor to all of you and give you a chance to ask questions, make comments, and we've got about an hour and a half for the full discussion. So I will stop here and I will turn the floor over to Özge.
Hello, everyone. I'm very excited to be here today. Thank you all for coming. I would like to thank all family, friends, colleagues, and particularly Luisa Bierasevich and Esther Perrin for guiding me through this long and rewarding journey, along with Shamun Zamir and colleagues and friends at Akasa Center for Photography. I would like to also thank the Amsterdam Center for European Studies, my editors at IB Taurus, and I'm very honored to be with all of you today at this event. I will start with a short presentation of my book. Here we go. Everything started with this photograph. In 2014, I found it in an antique shop opposite a historical bazaar in Izmir and had the immediate urge to purchase it from the shop owner who, with a look of arrogance, nearly refused to sell it to me. He had bought it at an auction and wanted to make sure that I was worthy of becoming its future owner. My fascination with the image stopped me from arguing any further. This was the only item I bought from him that day. Little did I know that this transaction would initiate a long journey of discoveries and academic challenges, paving the way for this book on photographic representations of the urban middle classes in Turkey in the 1920s and 30s. Vernacular photographs resonate with many of the social and political tensions of the time. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, under Mustafa Kemal Atatürk's leadership, Turkey was run by a one-party regime, safeguarding Kemalist reforms that aimed to help the country reach the level of quote-unquote civilized nations. Founded in 1923, after a decade-long war period, including the Turkish War of Independence, between 1919 and 1923, the ruling elites of the Turkish Republic tasked themselves with making a new Turkish nation, building upon the dynamics of the modernization efforts of the late Ottoman era. The Kemalist revolution was marked by a boundary management between the East and the West, between the desire for rapid Westernization and the anxiety to preserve traditions. This boundary management manifests itself in family photographs in relation to the role of women in society, the men's shifting position in the family, and the integration of older traditions into modern Republican imagery. Vernacular photographs give us glimpses into the increasingly secularized public life and changing social landscape. Photography played a key role in forging a desired class and gendered identity for the newly minted Turkish citizens who continuously performed, circulated, and negotiated the ideal citizen image imposed by the Kemalist regime. The representation of gender, particularly the visibility of women, stood at the heart of the Kemalist revolution. For the regime, the emancipation of women meant their participation in the public sphere and in the workforce, together with men, unveiled. In this context, beauty contests played an important role in promoting the image of the modern Republican woman, aiming to put Turkey on the global political map as an advanced westernized nation. In this image, the beauty queen of 1931, Naşide Saffet Hanım, poses for the camera in an official photo shoot hosted by the contest organizer, Cumhuriyet newspaper. Dressed elegantly, yet modestly, she represents not only the Western look that the Turkish state aspired to, but also the poise and sophistication that were supposed to accompany it. Naşide Saffet also represents the ideological confusion and social pressure that burdened Turkish women of the time. While in the public sphere, women remained the symbols and advocates of modernity, they were incorporated into the nation-building process as protectors of tradition at home. Under the influence of the rising fascist regimes in the 1930s, motherhood was designated as the primary national duty for Turkish women. One of the case studies in the book includes the seemingly ambiguous series of portraits featuring a prominent feminist educator, Nebahat Hamit Karaorman. This series urges us to rethink the ways in which we interpret gender in photographs. An advocate of Kemalist modernization, Nebahat Hamit is a fascinating figure, teaching sex education and campaigning against child marriage, yet defending traditional gender roles in the family. In Nebahat's portraits, the ambivalence of gender performance is not an act of subversion on her part or that of the photographer, but rather the ambivalence that inhabited the ideal Republican woman at the heart of Kemalist ideology. Vernacular photography greatly contributed to an emerging visual culture and collective social memory in the early Republic. The 1920s and 30s correspond to a period when well-established studio practices rapidly spread among the middle classes. Simultaneously, amateur photography was becoming popular among urban households, enabling a wider variety of representation of Turkishness outside the studio. Until the mid-1940s, when studio photography became largely democratized, itinerant or à la minute photographers filled the vacuum in the countryside, documenting large segments of society in smaller towns and remote villages. The choice of locations where à la minute photographers set up their cameras, for instance in a public park in Istanbul in this image, offers clues about the rapidly changing public life and the contribution of photography to the making of modern Republican spaces. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, we also observe how playfulness was gradually introduced to Turkish photography with the arrival of snapshot cameras into middle-class households. In this curious case from 1931, for instance, a small-size snapshot shows two men eating at home per the Ottoman Turkish inscription on the reverse, still used here despite the alphabet change in 1928. Signed by Feridun Mahmut, possibly one of the men in the picture, this highly staged image suggests that by the 1930s, the Turkish middle classes had discovered the performative potential of photography as a form of entertainment. Vernacular photographs reveal that urban middle-class citizens largely endorsed and actively participated in the making of the new Turkish men and women through their own photographic representations. At the same time, their efforts to build a secular middle-class life for themselves were not just informed by Kemalist policies, but also influenced by their class aspirations and other wider sociocultural developments of the 1920s and 30s, from Western fashion trends and movies to the increasing availability of modern consumer items, including amateur cameras. The complex networks in which photographic prints were circulated within and outside family circles served multiple functions as modes of communications and tokens of self-promotion. The desired image was not always faithfully reproduced, but sometimes tweaked by incorporating elements from Ottoman and ancient Turkic traditions such as circumcision ceremonies or childbed arrangements, by pushing the boundaries of gender norms or by introducing playfulness. Such tweaking was possible in vernacular photography to a greater extent than in non-vernacular photographs, the appearance and circulation of which were under the control of the Kemalist regime. The wealth of vernacular material from those years available in antique markets and in collections offers a fascinating lens into everyday life of the time. The ordinariness of these photographs is what makes them a great resource for understanding, imagining, and reconstructing the broader social histories in which they were produced. Through this research, I hope not only to have contributed to a better understanding of the making of the modern Turkish citizen in the early republic, but also to have elevated vernacular photographs as objects to the level of rich first-hand resources for academic research by placing them at the center of cultural analysis. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all very much for being here today at our shared book presentation. Thanks also Özge for such a wonderful presentation, and as a colleague and friend, so I have to say it's not entirely, you know, like unbiased, but still I can wholeheartedly recommend that you buy her book, because it's a really fantastic read, and many beautiful photographic material, a lot of beautiful photographic material. So, and this is your chance because it's with a discount. So, just saying. I thank all of you, family, friends, and colleagues, for being here, but also for supporting me along the way to complete this project that started quite a long time ago. Luisa already briefly mentioned this. It's been almost 10 years. And a special word of thanks also to the Amsterdam Center for European Studies for providing us with the opportunity to present our monographies today. Also special thanks to, I believe they're watching, the editors at IB Tauris, Yasmin Garcha and Rory Gormley, for their assistance through the publishing process, and my again esteemed colleagues involved in the event together here with me today, Luisa Bierasevich, Guido Snell and Özge Calafato. So I would like to introduce you today to a few of the juicier bits of my book, representing modern Istanbul, urban history and international institutions in 20th century Beyoğlu, which is quite a mouthful. The subtitle explains that the book is principally about Beyoğlu, which is a central historical district in Istanbul, rather than Istanbul, strictly speaking, the metropolitan area. So yeah, here you see historical Beyoğlu on the current sort of geography of Istanbul. Yet since this is a cultural history of Beyoğlu and of Istanbul, it is important to note, I believe, that what is represented as historical Istanbul in various ways often converges to what is actually Beyoğlu, meaning Beyoğlu is being overdetermined as Istanbul, in similar ways that another representation of Istanbul is actually an overdetermined historical peninsula, which you will be familiar with from Hagia Sophia, Topkapı Palace, and other religious and dynastic Ottoman landmarks. It is this problem of overdetermination and other problems that I have engaged with in this book, which focuses on the representations of Beyoğlu in the second half of the 20th century. You can see the current administrative boundaries over here. And this district was founded originally as a Genoese settlement in Byzantine times and would become the de facto center of the Ottoman capital after 1453, but especially reaching its climax in the 19th century. Currently it is still at the heart of Istanbul's historical core, although the city's transformation into a metropole means historical Beyoğlu's role in the city as a touristic space would become increasingly pronounced, especially again since the 1990s. In this book I have researched the accounts of historical travelers, residents, foreign and local alike, which point out that this was in various ways a fascinating place to be. Up to this date, elderly men, and some of you may be familiar with, like different variations of this this story. Elderly men will nostalgically recount how fancy a place Beyoğlu was until the 1960s, and that you could not go there without a tie, a hat, a crease in your trousers, and that the times have obviously changed for the worse. On the other hand, it has also been presented as the place not to be. So a place of nightclubs, brothels, public drinking, dancing, gambling, and a general lack of morale and cleanliness. Those are equally popular ways to represent Beyoğlu. And just to give you a short anecdote that connects to that, a writer named Mustafa Remzi writes on the arrival of jazz to Istanbul and Beyoğlu in the 1920s in his book Öldüren Dans, The Dance That Kills, and he recounts, dancing amidst the jumping and maddening noise of the jazz band is certain to turn a young girl into a prostitute and a man into a murderer, a madman, or at the very least an imbecile. Although these stereotypes are rather useless, obviously, to interpret the daily lives of people in Beyoğlu and Istanbul, they do inform us about how communities like to represent themselves or are represented from the outside. And I think the same holds true for communities and spaces at the local level. Beyoğlu, on the one hand, the cosmopolitan bon vivant utopia where the elites nibble at their cakes and sip their liquors in a place with a quote-unquote European buzz. So like Regence, Pera Palace, Cercle d'Orient, you can feel indeed the European buzz also in those names. But also Beyoğlu, Istanbul's place of moral deprivation and shady nightclubs. And these stereotypes are, in the case of Beyoğlu, particularly important because they have such a strong impact on the ways in which the area is represented up to this day. These stereotypes resonate in urban nostalgia on Beyoğlu and Istanbul and Turkey, particularly since the 1980s again, and partly due to that featured in a wide array of studies of 19th century and early 20th century Istanbul especially. The 1980s witnessed an explosion also of fiction and popular histories of the area around the late 19th century, which has witnessed also recent incarnations. Some of you may be even familiar with that, because as you are well aware, everything of significance needs to be a Netflix show these days. So why not Beyoğlu? And the most recent incarnation of that is a rather kitschy Netflix show, I'm sorry I have to say, but which is called Pera Palas'ta Gece Yarısı, so Midnight at Pera Palace, about the famous Pera Palace Hotel, in which a journalist time travels to the hotel's heydays around the early 1900s. Another more interesting example, so if you want a viewing recommendation, this is the one to go for, that you may have heard of, engages with the vibrant nightlife of Beyoğlu and the pogroms against non-Muslim communities that took place in 1955, which is the show Kulüp or Club. Now, for this book, I was mostly interested in the period preceding this upsurge in urban nostalgia that I mentioned, so between a period between 1950 and 1980 approximately. And this period is in the context also of European urban history more broadly speaking, often framed as the post-war period, and is somewhat neglected, you could argue, in urban history generally. And if it is addressed, it is mostly from a perspective of reconstruction and urban planning. And this perspective of urban planning was also very much applicable to Istanbul and Beyoğlu, where the historiography on Istanbul was very limited, or indeed engages with particularly these issues of urban planning, urban destruction. And that is quite remarkable, since these 30 to 40 years are of fundamental significance for Istanbul and, through proxy, also Turkey. The city which grew out from a diverse mid-sized city to a regional metropole with very different diversities. Now, to come to an understanding of these 3 to 4 decades in the city and the district's history, I needed microcosms of Beyoğlu and Istanbul in which I could sort of trace symptomatic processes that reflected broader trends of representational culture in the district, the city, and the country. And I therefore studied 2 clubs, 3 schools, and their respective buildings and sites. Now, all these institutions were set up in the late Ottoman Empire and have either explicit foreign connections, so an English girls' school, that's why you're looking here at Queen Elizabeth in 1972, who visited the English school for girls, currently the Beyoğlu Anatolian High School, a German club and school. So here you also see, you know, like the actually strong embedment of foreign agency in Beyoğlu, but also more local, I would say, like local parties, such as the Cercle Orient, which was a gentleman's club, where you would see, you know, like a variation of the multicultural elite milieu of Ottoman Pera and Beyoğlu. Now, I expected that the continued presence of these institutions would shed some light on the problematic ways in which Beyoğlu's communal and spatial demise after the 1950s was represented. And I also expected that the continued presence of these institutions would shed some light on the problematic ways in which Beyoğlu's demise after, sorry, I'm repeating myself here, after the 1950s was represented. Let me briefly sketch you some of the outcomes of 2 of my case studies. The first one that I would like to talk about is the Galatasaray High School, which has a, you know, like the namesake of the football club. Here we see, you know, like actually a class portrait from the 1940s of Galatasaray. Yes, this is for your reference for the football club. Now, what I did in the case of this this case study is that I looked at the accounts of alumni, and so the graduates of this high school, and how they represented themselves vis-à-vis this institution. And this school, it's perhaps interesting to know, was erected at first as a high school for prospective Ottoman bureaucrats. And these alumni, you know, like they also feel sort of the weight of this history, because they continuously imagine their memories to be very strongly connected to this historical place in Galatasaray, in the Galatasaray High School and Beyoğlu. And for all these alumni, the Galatasaray building and quote-unquote their Beyoğlu remains the setting and point of reference for their childhood and adolescent memories. And as much as they cherish the memories from their days at the high school, I also found that the students of Galatasaray reflected shifting attitudes towards multiculturalism that existed within the framework of Turkish nationalism. Whereas some feel the need to stress that they were not racist or cherish memories regarding their quote-unquote Turkified Armenian teachers, other, older graduates felt instilled with pride, recounting memories of stories on attacks against local Istanbulite Greek-speaking citizens, so the Rum citizens. And such a diversity in attitudes also makes the school, in that sense, a telling microcosm of more general tropes of representations of Beyoğlu, ranging from multiculturalist nostalgia to xenophobia. Yet my research also engages with the issue of how the departure of some institutions can make the way for new legacies. So around the building of this elite gentlemen's club, the Cercle d'Orient or Büyükulüp that I previously mentioned before, you see that a vibrant cinema production culture started to arise, particularly from the 1950s onwards. And this Turkish Hollywood produced at its peak close to 400 movies per year, with anything ranged from so-called kebab westerns to local variations of Star Trek, but also pornography, comedies, local dramas with heavy involvement of local pop stars a la Elvis Presley in that sense. And this cinema production nurtured the cultural or escapist appetite of young families, women and men, but it also has become a hotbed for a lasting memory of and heritage also of cinema. Yet nowadays, actually, this heritage in the spaces is hardly anywhere to be found, unfortunately, because its premises of this building have been subject to destructive urban redevelopment. And that brings me also to my conclusion. What the case of Beyoğlu demonstrates is that the area was next to decline, primarily caused by the forced departure of significant portions of its residents, also subject to a significant deal of continuity in its functionalities, and saw, in a sense, also gradual shifts in its usage profile and users' profile. Similar to other metropoles in which historical landscapes and rapid urban transformation come together, historical Istanbul and Beyoğlu are highly complex and palimpsestic historical landscapes, and as such any major intervention to its landscape should ideally negotiate these historical complexities, layers and association. This, however, pertains equally to the layers of the first decades of the Turkish Republic and before, which we see featuring very strongly in this urban nostalgia, as it does to the periods between the 1950s and the 1990s, which we much see considerably less in this representation. And Beyoğlu has in part, as an effect of these overdetermined representations, become a place that urban developers and government officials conveniently stigmatize as a district where, quote, the dirt needs to be cleaned up, or it is represented as the poisoned prince that needs to be saved from its pitiful destiny. This book is in conclusion also therefore a direct critical call to reject the dismissal of the right to placemaking and history writing, and representing instead the area through the lens of overdetermined nostalgia. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks Enno, thanks Özge for not just wonderful presentations but also very suggestive photographs that I think give us a lot of food for talking. And like Luisa, I was very fortunate to be part of, especially of the process of Enno's research coming about, the book. And I had the honor of serving on your committee, so I was familiar with your work prior to this event as well. I would like to start with a question to both of you, which is how you, so to speak, you came across the actual cases that you're working on. So I understood that you basically stumbled across this photograph, stumbled across an archive, whereas I know from Enno's case, and I would love to hear a bit more about this also for the audience, that you painstakingly put together the cases that finally make up the analysis of the book. So first, Özge, how does one stumble across an archive?
Hello.
Hello.
By maybe building one. I did my research on a collection that I built as I was working for the Akasa Center for Photography at NYU Abu Dhabi, and we were building a photography archive from the Middle East and North Africa, contested definitions. For the purposes of practicalities, I used that, and we decided to build a photography collection from Turkey as well, and I knew that there is material, quite a lot actually, and in antique shops and second-hand booksellers. So I started collecting those, and for very reasonable prices with resources from the university. So I built that collection for the university. And so I realized that no one was actually looking at the collection. So when you build a collection, an archive, it's really to put it to good use. And I was particularly interested in the 1920s and 30s. It's a very interesting period from the transition from the Ottoman Empire to the early Turkish Republic. But also I soon realized no one was looking at this period through vernacular photography, which is, it's so obvious, it's out there and visually so appealing. But a lot of people are very much into the Ottoman photography side of things, so I kind of took that up. And so this kind of the research project came about through that. And in terms of the case studies, that's a very interesting methodology that kind of unfolded as I was working with photographs. So I always wanted to start from the photograph, meaning what the photograph tells me, how it speaks back. So oftentimes there is data, there is metadata, inscriptions, dates, locations, but the names were not necessarily that important. So I would choose the photograph and then sometimes I would trace back, and sometimes, I would trace it to a certain degree and sometimes completely anonymous. And I'll give it, I'll leave it there, but what's also interesting is how much you can find out through just one name or one, a few details that you find on the inscriptions, which also says a lot about what photography meant for the urban and middle class and upper middle classes at the time. The access that these classes had, and they all turned out to be, educators, soldiers, doctors, and there's a lot of information about that. So that was also very interesting. Yeah. I can tell more. Yeah, maybe
we'll ask you more about the photos. Yes, you can be sure of that. Enno, you discussed today here, you presented briefly your work on the Galatasaray High School and the Cercle d'Orient. How about the other cases? Altogether, what would you say, what are they representative of?
Well, I'm in very different things, and that is also, this is in part caused by the complexity of this district and sort of the threads that come together in this district. So, generally speaking, geopolitically, culturally, and also nationally, these 30 years between the 50s and the 80s are very complicated years for Turkey, and that is also represented in that sense in this area. So, what I think. On the one hand, if I would have to pick maybe two common main threads, is indeed that on the one hand we see the enduring platform that Beyoğlu offers to diplomacy, geopolitics, and also sort of an exposure to an international arena, if you like, through these international schools, which are actively sponsored by the British Council, in the case of the English High School for Girls, and by the West German government, in the case of the German high school. And these are really, in that sense, considered to be very significant, especially in this situation of Cold War geopolitics, as significant instruments by the UK, German, and Turkish government. So this is one sort of significant trend, I think, that you see in Beyoğlu that is often neglected. On the other hand, I think also. These institutions represent, and that is also something that was partly the main thesis of the book that I tried to engage with, to what extent do we see discontinuity, which is rightfully very much discussed because it is one, and is a Beyoğlu is also subject, you know, like to very violent both nationalist unmakings of spaces and communities, and later on also of neoliberal unmakings of spaces and communities. But I also wanted to trace, to get a sort of to be able to sketch, in a sense, the complexity of this district, to show also some of the continuities in this district and sort of the new legacies that are built sort of on the well, sometimes quite literally ashes of, you know, like of this destruction. And that is something that I think, you know, like is shown in this cinema culture on the one hand, but it's also shown in the case of the Galatasaray High School, that we have this, you know, like a really elite high school which cultivates such a strong Francophone tradition, which also sits somewhat uncomfortably between, you know, like this admiration for a Europe, but on the other hand also, you know, like cultivates these, you know, like in part xenophobic nationalist sentiments. And it also shows indeed that, you know, like that also these people, which supposedly should resent Beyoğlu because of what it represented, being cosmopolitan, being multicultural, that they very actively claim their place in the district and see this place as belonging to them, which is, you know, on a variety of levels of you know, like interpreting nationalist discourse in Turkey very interesting, because I mean, typically, I mean, like Beyoğlu, if you read like memoirs from people who cooperated with Adnan Menderes, for instance, who was responsible for one of the main waves of destruction, urban destruction in the 1950s. There you see, you know, like a really very strong antipathy, in a sense, against Beyoğlu, and especially what Beyoğlu represented, namely something foreign, something alien. Yet this, you know, like sort of pivot of nationalism or of elite Turkishness, Francophone Turkishness, ironically enough, is able to I mean, these alumni are able to posit themselves as, you know, like belonging to Beyoğlu nonetheless. You know. Yeah. So these are some of the more interesting things, I think. You know, that
so when I'm listening to both of you, we're really diving into a very complex history here, and your books contribute to an excavating and a reconstruction of a history that is much more layered than, for instance, the nostalgia of the 90s, the 1990s wants us to believe. So I was wondering, and maybe this is also an invitation to both of you to comment on each other's book, because this is what people are going to do afterwards, they're going to buy a copy of both, and then they would read first your book, Özge, because it starts chronologically first, and then they would read your book. What would be the longue durée history that your two projects offer together? And maybe you can answer for Özge and you can answer for Enno. Would you like to start? Yeah?
Yeah, I find it, I mean, as you were also saying during your presentation, it's really 50s onwards, 50s and 80s, between the 50s and 80s, is not a period that's looked at, not only, also within Turkey, scholarship that is in Turkish, we don't get to really see that in terms of social histories especially. There is the political history, of course, because every 10 years there was a coup d'etat, and you have that kind of very broad-scale history that's written about. But I think, and of course, in particular, the history, social history of Beyoğlu is, you know, really missing. So I find that, yeah, very timely, very important contribution to that. And as you're saying, it's constantly changing, and it's really a case for the broader kind of scene in modern Turkey.
Yeah. Enno?
I mean, I think the strong merit of Özge's book is that she, through looking very much at like representational culture, she is able to provide like new insights in a variety of topics that we thought we kind of understood, because this period that the book engages with is like a period that is featured very strongly in Turkish national historiography, both the nationalist thesis and like the critical historiography. But there is a sincere, quite a strong neglect, I feel, like, I mean, of course there are many solid works who also engage with like different modes of representation, but not much like innovative like scholarly work that actually engages with a specific medium of photography, and also a specific medium that transcends, and I think that is also another strong merit of this book, that transcends like this perspective of the elites. So that is something also I struggled with, because I mean, in a sense, like, by looking at these clubs and institutions, sometimes you're also reproducing narratives of elites. Whereas, like the vernacular photography, for instance, that Özge works with, really, like shows us, like a perspective on the daily lives of these people who are being pushed to become something new, but also something of that they historically already were, and that is also why it's so interesting that she also not only looks at the pictures but also at the inscriptions that are connected with the photographs. I mean, like the example that Özge now gave, like during the presentation, that people still use the Ottoman Turkish rather than the modern Turkish with the Latinized alphabet is in that sense also quite telling. And I mean, the common thread is, I think, like between these books is that it both tries to connect with these daily lives and these, like more local versions of histories within all these grand narratives, and that is, I think, like another, like strong innovative aspect of both of the books.
I was also hoping, Enno, that you would tell us something in your presentation about a German school, because there especially you came across almost anecdotal personal histories where a historian would really ask him or herself, how to contextualize this. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, the Cold War story of Eastern German ships on the Bosphorus and people jumping overboard.
Yeah.
And then, so this is very personal, very also local history. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, there is this much larger, continuously in both your work, this much larger geopolitical context, and it makes it a very exciting read, I have to say. I also, because these are both beautiful examples of, I would say, cultural analysis and cultural history, social history perhaps. It's a mix anyhow. And let's not argue about the boundaries between cultural studies and cultural history. The fact is that these are both books that engage with really important source materials. And for those people in the audience who are less familiar with your methodologies, I would like to ask you some clarification about how you went about, that is, methodologically. So, for instance, Enno, you at some points in your book you talk about placemaking, whereas perhaps for a person who is not informed about your methodology, aren't places just there? You take a plane to Istanbul and the first place you go to is Beyoğlu, because that's where everybody is headed if you're not going to the historical peninsula. And the clubs are there, the buildings are there. What do you mean by placemaking?
Mm-hmm. Okay, okay, that's a good question. I mean, I hope it's like adequately explained in the book. I mean, through this journey of of writing the book, which was effectively, my PhD thesis. Apart from being a historian, I became sort of a part-time geographer also. I mean, thanks to Luisa. So I mean, I tried. I mean, historians, like they generally, like have a problem engaging with space and place. So they are very much engaged with the temporal dimensions, but you know, like they are not. I mean, when they speak of a particular place, even when it's urban history, so then there's a much more local dimension. Yeah, you could argue. I mean, the way that, especially until, like, say, the early 2000s, historians would engage with space and place was very much as a significant setting, maybe, or, you know, like, I mean, there's this example by a historian, you know, like, who tries to critically engage with that. He says, like, we are writing a national history of, I don't know, like, vernacular traditions in Germany. What does Germany mean in this context, you know, like, spatially speaking? And I think, you know, like, geographers are much better equipped to engage with, you know, like, what is space, what is place, and what placemaking in this book effectively means is, you know, like, that, you know, like, different communities, you know, like, in effectively, physically speaking, the same space, you could argue, make that space into a very different, personal, communal space, both by actively, or, you know, like, physically being in that space and, you know, like, performing their place in the district. So the district of bankers, the district of the residents, the districts of the hoteliers, and they obviously interact. You know, the Beolo of the Orthodox Greeks, the Beolo of Catholic Levantines, the Beolo of, you know, like, Muslim working classes, and so on and so forth. So I mean, these you have, you know, like, in the same space, you know, like, a variety of communities, people who make their place. And the interesting thing about that is also that it is not only being made on the site, but it's also, I mean, in that sense, more metaphorically speaking, a place that is transported over borders. For instance, by, I mean, there's an anthropologist, Eli Ers, who has done a fantastic project on this. Beolo is obviously also transported to many places, either by people being forced to leave the area, or by more or less their own choice. But I mean, you could argue that Beolo very much lives also in Athens. It very much lives also in Şişli, so the adjoining district. It lives very much also in Büyükada. It lives very much also in Amsterdam. So that is also another dimension of placemaking. So the place is both enacted, but it's also, in that sense, is something that is remembered, you know, like, and cherished, and then also morphed into something well, that is maybe closer to nostalgia than lived experience.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks, Enno. And similar question to you, Özge. Your source material are photographs, obviously. The traditional take on photos is that, and this is very traditional, this is that they're just there. They're snapshots of reality. But you engage in a discussion of these photos where you speak about positioning and self-positioning and self-fashioning. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yeah, thank you. I work with the concept of performativity, so I looked at how Turkish citizens in the making performed in photographs. So they performed the modern Turkish man and woman that was imposed on them, but how they tweaked that and how those negotiations worked. So that, I think, vernacular photography really shows those negotiations, you know, in many nuanced ways. And so I looked at also the performativities of femininities, modern Turkish femininities, masculinities, but also the modern husband, the modern mother, also the modern child, because these are all social constructs. We also see the kind of these performances in one picture on different levels, and we also, you know, talk about the discovery of the child and raising a child, and how the modern family is represented as this Republican, secular, modern Republican unit. So I looked at, yeah, that aspect, but also looking at, of course, indexicality and kind of deducting broader social histories.
Yeah. Maybe I can follow up on that, because one of the intriguing things in your presentation in the beginning was what you were claiming about the prominent feminist educator Nebahat Hamid Karaorman, which are really intriguing series of photographs. They really they almost instantaneously turn you into a voyeur. What is she doing? What is she performing? And your conclusion about this series of portraits is rather outspoken. You say they are seemingly ambiguous. Why seemingly?
Yeah, I wonder what everyone thinks, because I think it really plays with our gaze, and I also question myself for thinking that. This really came when I was kind of working on my selection, and these photographs were very visually interesting. And then, but the question really came when we were cataloging as a team, because in the archive you catalog a woman, a man, and also why do we use that kind of set of metadata? So that's also another question that we started asking, but we really stumbled upon this question. And another interesting thing about archives, even when you create one yourself, is one of the pictures, which was bigger, was displaced, or I had maybe bought it separately, because vendors also themselves categorize the photographs that they're selling based on what they like, or based on size, so it was like misplaced. So it was really through that final photograph that we thought, it's the same person, and there is a bit of inscription, and there's a building at the back, which I asked my mom. She knew that it's the teacher's school in Istanbul. It's again from the Ottoman times, Çapa. And I started Googling these keywords, and there she was, another photograph, another seller selling another batch. So that's also very interesting how much you can actually, how much is out there. But the question remains as to why she was going to different studios in the 1920s, playing with her self-image. Also, these 6 images are from 5 different studios in Istanbul, in Beyoğlu, all of which, and prominent photography studios at the time. Only one of them were a Muslim photographer, the others are non-Muslim photographers. It also says a lot about the early days of the Turkish Republic and the profile of kind of the social landscape of Beyoğlu at the time. So it's also, I think it really urges us to question how we see gender in photographs. And sometimes we tend to over-interpret as well, or overread gender representations. But I was also a bit lucky because I found newspaper articles with interviews with her, and she was a prominent feminist writer, but not as prominent as some of the other names. So she was kind of a bit under the radar, but she has incredible interviews in the newspapers in the 1930s about against child marriage, but also saying that a good spouse is like wine. So with age, marriage only gets better. So she also has those. So it's a very interesting, multi-layered also profile of a westernized Kemalist educator. And final note, because she's always haunting me, she donated all her assets to a Kemalist education foundation. So it also kind of, that's how I was able to deduct her profile a little more.
I mean, it's truly fascinating, and I'm also wondering, and you also, I think you suggested this yourself, you also start to question your own gaze. Am I not observing more in this series of photographs than was intended by the person on the photo who went to these various studios? But then again, did she actually know herself what the effects of her postures were? So that's, I mean, it's truly fascinating. Yeah.
Exactly, and the question remains, why did she go to these studios? She definitely had a relationship to photography in you know, in complex ways.
Yeah. Maybe that's subject matter for a Netflix series. That would really sort of... Yeah. Another more of a general question to both of you. And maybe Luisa also wants to jump in here, because I know this is a subject that is very close to your own interests. So in both of your books, you see a sort of, perhaps not counter histories, but at least sort of side histories to what you could call this monologic, hegemonic ideology that tries to turn the modern republic into, well, what exactly? That's of course up for questions, but it's very obvious that there's an outspoken current in the 20th century and even up to today, one could argue, in the Turkish Republic as to what is the ideal Turkish citizen. And the least one can say about your two books is that you uncover alternatives, alternative histories. How formative was this in the initial stages of your work? Is there sort of, I'm not asking about a hidden agenda or the sort of a normative agenda, but I know from my own experience that if you're confronted all the time with this sort of predominant language that tells you this is how we are, this is how we set out to be, that of course you start to question, to start questions about it. See, so okay, so what are the alternatives? You know, what are you not telling me? Was this a motivation in your projects?
Me? Yeah, definitely. And I also, I mean, this is, I think, very interesting, especially when you work with vernacular photographs where there's very little to work with and you really want to see so much more. And sometimes it's not there. And when it's not there, it's also okay, you know. And this is, one of the ways to go around it is I looked at a lot of pictures. So of course my selection is around 60 images from the collection, which is already 17,000 photographs, 3,000 of which would be from the 1920s and 30s, but I also looked at other archives, including archives of, you know, families and friends, but also booksellers nowadays sell a lot of material online. So what you see on these shopping websites is bigger than any archive that's, and this is a whole different, of course, issue. But having looked at a very large body of photographs, I also kind of try to look at representations, you know, the kind of, take kind of an average almost, or looking at recurring categories. So I also worked with that. So yeah.
Yeah. Maybe, Enno, to you the very specific question would be, because this is one of the very obstinate self-images since the 1990s of Beyoğlu, is its nostalgia. Mm-hmm. How did you cope with nostalgia as a grand narrative?
Yeah. Well, I mean, so I mean, nostalgia in a way is not a bad thing. I mean, like we see that in our personal milieus as well. I suppose also pertaining specifically to Beyoğlu. So there are many friends, probably also here, you know, like who sort of like have a deep sorrow for instance, destruction of cinemas in Beyoğlu, which is, I think, like very appropriate. But and so there are different, like, I mean, and I'm not sort of, like trying to sort of say that there are legitimate and illegitimate nostalgias, but I think, like, there's a colleague at Eldam who was of great influence also to this book, like had considerable critique on sort of the what this nostalgia does actually, and especially sort of the nostalgia that comes up, as I briefly showed in the presentation, in the 1980s, but also endures into the 2000s, and that we also see to a a degree, for instance, like prominent writers like Elif Shafak or Orhan Pamuk, sort of this celebration of pre-1960s Istanbul and also Beyoğlu's history, which raises the question, what actually is going on after the 1960s? Like, is everything? I mean, of course, we know. I mean, that like a lot was destroyed. And that is also one of the problematic things in this particular branch of nostalgia. That often, I mean, especially in the early years, this was not really an issue that was being discussed. What actually happened with this these communities that constituted this quote-unquote cosmopolitanism, multiculturalism. So why are actually these places all gone? So that was, I mean, and that is something that Etemel'dem addressed. I mean, this is not really engaged with. They engage, like rather superficially, like with, like the absence of certain spaces. But and that sort of like, and then like government officials, of course, and like real estate speculators, they will see like potential in that, because by cultivating that image of like a historical cosmopolitanism, you make the area also interesting for tourist purposes. But that again leaves out like the sort of the historical dimension of destruction actually. So that is something I think like that is somewhat problematic on the one hand, but on the other hand also, I mean, there is still this gap between what happens between the 60s and say 80s or even the 90s, and that is something, I mean, I tried to engage with through these very local histories, sort of to provide maybe a somewhat of a counter narrative against these well, what I would say to a great extent also a fiction of Beyoğlu, so that everything in from the 60s to the 70s, like becomes like a no-go area, a dangerous area, like a dirty area, a place where families or women should not go. Whereas we have, like we have banks there, we have industries there, we have like local commerces there, we have schools there. I mean, so there is also a considerable endurance that is sort of like being twisted and suppressed in these nostalgias. And of course, like if you're coming from a narrative of destruction, this is somewhat understandable that you're focusing on the destruction rather than the endurance. But as I sort of in the afterthought of the presentation tried to suggest also, this is very risky because, I mean, it also invites, like people in governments or, like private investors to skew this image in such a way that Beyoğlu is basically a dirty place and it could be so much more, so let's just clean up the dirt and, like get rid of, like all those shaky 19th century buildings. So that in that sense, like the nostalgia is also quite problematic, and the book shows that actually the 60s and 70s, albeit 80s, albeit in very different ways, were very lively for very lively decades for Beyoğlu, and in a sense also fundamental for Beyoğlu.
Yeah. Luisa?
Well, I mean, one of the things that I wanted, I guess, to follow up on the first part of your question about, both the books, not necessarily even providing a counter-narrative, but much more, I guess, depth and context to, this imagined making of Turkish modernity in two very different moments in time, but very much, kind of a localized and embodied understanding of how, it was thought of, how it was literally embodied, how it was made in and into place. And so, I mean, if there's one thread that I see running through both of those, and what I loved about both these pieces of research was, kind of thinking through these different ways of how modernity could be, literally performed with bodies for the camera, but also performed in space, right? And so very much kind of contesting this, grand narrative of modernity as something very much, kind of put in place by the state, by certain ideologies, and, how people literally played with it. So I don't know if, if you, I'm also conscious of the time, so if you can give us just a very quick answer, and then we'll open it up to the floor.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's also why I was very interested in vernacular photographs, to kind of, as it were, to see, what citizens are telling about themselves through photographs. And it's true that they were largely engaged with the modern citizen image, but not necessarily because it was imposed upon them, by an authoritarian regime, but they were also trying to fit in to a new home, which was, modern Turkey. And also it's very, important to remember the immense demographic mobilities that happened in the 1920s after the war period, starting from the late 19th century, but, Greek-Turkish population exchange, the war, and 1915. So that's, you see a lot of new populations coming to Turkey, and they're told, okay, so there's a new republic, and now there's a new identity. So there was also this kind of organic way of performing this identity, also to find employment in government, which was the biggest employer at the time. Also, this was a marker for class, and this is actually one of the core topics in my research, that it's what we see is a very much clearly defined class identity. Even though the Kemalist revolution aimed for a classless society, but what we see is really the urban middle class image, which is now kind of what we see as, we associate with as the modern Turkish citizen.
And I should have actually said that, because it wasn't, for both of you, not just modernity, but a very particular bourgeois urban modernity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
In your case was very much, thinking of the clubs that you studied and all the other sites as well.
Yeah, yeah. The way for me it was also a practical choice in that sense, to choose within Beyoğlu, and people, who are not familiar with the topic are thinking can't you do a comprehensive history of 30 years of Beyoğlu in Istanbul, one district? But the place is so complex and so layered indeed, that I really needed these very specific localities really to get a grasp of what was actually going on, or at least not necessarily representative, but indeed symptomatic of some broader trends that were going on in these spaces and histories. And I think, we spoke now a little bit already about the Galatasaray High School, where it indeed is, the performative element in space and the cultivation of a connection to the space is very apparent and obvious, but it's actually what I think, the book also shows, in various passages more explicitly and some more implicitly, and took actually, a different eye, sort of a different scholar to highlight this to me. But what the book in a sense also shows indeed, that Beyoğlu in these years also becomes more of a place where not only these bourgeois people, or the people who want to pretend to be part of this bourgeois milieu, have an opportunity to, especially along this axis of the main axis of the Istiklal Caddesi, to perform themselves, but it becomes also in that sense maybe a slightly more democratic place in at least in the daytime. Nighttime is a different story, but in the daytime it becomes a place also where with greater accessibility for middle class performance of like identity in space. So in that sense, I think, yeah, I mean, that is also an interesting development, I think, like in these years. And, yeah.
Should we open up?
I think so, because I think we've got, you know, we're supposed to close off in 15 minutes, so we've got some time.
Yeah, we have a. You have a question? Yeah. Do we have a?
I will give you the mic.
Thank you very much. I'll hand you the mic. It's for you, right?
Yeah. And then.
Hi. Thanks very much for this interesting presentation. My question is for Özge. Özge, you talked about the urban representations of modern Turkish citizen, and I wanted, because I also know that you mentioned it in the book, to see a little bit of the contextualization of non-Muslim Turkish communities in that representation landscape. So how would you contextualize Turkish Armenian, Turkish Greek photographers or subjects of photography in that period, and how are they becoming entangled with this whole Kemalist project of Turkish citizenship? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. In my research, this was one of the key questions that I asked myself a lot. And the way I went about it is to look at the representation of Turkishness and how Turkishness was defined by the state, and in relation to that, how this was negotiated in photographs. So one of the aspects of that is the language. So I looked at the Turkish language. So I didn't, for instance, study photographs with Armenian inscription or Greek inscription or French or Ladino at the time. So I was very much interested in how these components of Turkishness, as it was defined, manifest themselves in photographs. And therefore, it's about how, you know, the relationship between photography and gender, photography and space, photography and language are projected, are represented. I very much hope to do more research, and particularly focusing on the communities, different communities. But for me, it was a bit outside the scope of what I wanted to do. But in terms of course, the photography scene, you see a rapid Turkification of the scene itself, and of course, with the inscriptions, I mean, losing the language is another aspect. But I chose Turkish inscriptions as part of this definition of Turkishness.
There was a question there.
Thank you. I had a bit of a similar question, actually, towards you, because you mentioned the rural-urban differences and then the class sensibilities and the class aspirations. But I was wondering, I haven't read the book or anything, so maybe it's in there. The ethno-religious aspect of these differences, my question would be on that, in the sense that, because while representing a certain Turkishness, you are not representing, excluding a certain understanding. And this was happening during the time when there's a certain repression also happening throughout the country. How do you think this element played in terms of creating a Turkishness that excluded, and what is the danger of that maybe for the current time? Because now there's a certain nostalgia of this type of imagery, how we used to be in the mindset. And then how it also creates a certain undesirable bodies that needs to still be repressed. And and kicked out, basically. So how do you assess this difference and then this danger element by posing this or analyzing this type of images? Thank you, and thank you for the talk.
Thank you. Yeah, so it is really the absence of certain types of representations doesn't mean that those representations didn't exist. It is about, as I said, I looked at thousands, tens of thousands of images. So in that, the communities that, yeah, rural communities, certain, different ethnic groups, religious groups, they are not represented in vernacular photographs at the time, precisely because of the access and also the class nature of photography at the time. So this is basically my research is about what is there and the material that is out there, what does that say about how this image was constructed as a modern Turkish citizen, but it's very much gendered, classed citizen image. So it doesn't mean, of course, you do have different types of representations to a lesser degree, thanks to the Alamini, the itinerant photographers that traveled across. But again, there are not so many surviving images of that. So yeah, the idea is that looking at the bulk of the production and what does that indicate and how, and precisely as you say, these are the images that a lot of people look at today, and coming back to the idea of nostalgia, look at the good old days of the early Republican, modernity, but it was deliberately constructed as a classed image.
I mean,
the nostalgia point, definitely.
Yeah, so it's. I mean, Beolo is in that sense maybe somewhat of a different. Very much part also of this dynamic, I would say. I mean, it connects a little bit also to what I said earlier, in the sense that with that the nostalgic upsurge of the 1980s, there actually this issue of communal difference is treated in a very superficial fashion. So it is it is a cosmopolitanism that is gone, but what that cosmopolitan actually means beyond sort of a rather ambiguous discourse, or maybe some mezes on a menu card, or playing Greek music in a taverna. The communities in that sense are absent, or the heritage of the communities is absent. I mean, it is something that, especially in the last 10 years or so, I think 2005, when sort of the first conference on the Armenian genocide was organized, is very significant in that context as well. But I mean, in the last 15 years or so, there is a greater consideration also for these the substance and the agency of these communities also, so beyond the nostalgia, I would say. Yeah.
So there was a question all the way in the back.
Thank you for the wonderful talks. I have small questions for both. One for Özge first, and it's connected to the previous questions. I was wondering, did you research until when this Ottoman let's say Arabic script, Ottoman Turkish script, was used, and by whom? Is it for the person who ordered the picture, or by the photographer? And does that say something about the photographer? And the other is about the name we saw of a photographer for Enno Maessen. One of the photograph of the Galatasaray High School, it carries the name of Weinberg, which is very much a Jewish name. So from such signs, we can also say a lot about who made the pictures and for whom.
Yeah, thank you for this question. It's very interesting because you have the alphabet change in 1928 from the Ottoman script to the Latin script. But it's interestingly, you see the Ottoman script through the 1940s, sometimes even 1950, through the 1930s for sure. And that's also one of the areas where that shows us how Kemalist revolution was negotiated. For instance, you have the hat law. In 1925 that banned the fez. But when it comes to the language, even though there was a rigorous, language reform, the alphabet change, the kind of education was one of the top priorities for the regime, there is this room in which people could continue writing, and this was not seen as a threat. It was seen as, and Hale Yilmaz talks about it, this kind of the elderly population who couldn't keep up. That's okay, that's not a threat to the... And there were even politicians, prominent writers who kept notes in the Ottoman script until the 40s. So that's a very interesting kind of case also. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, very briefly, there's also like some examples. For instance, of like Adnan Menderes, so the prime minister in the 1950s, who, and he was trained in an Anglophone tradition. So he was, even before the language reforms, very much, like equipped, in at least English, and through that, obviously, also the Latin alphabet. So he was perfectly able to write in the Latin script. But some people also argue that this was actually a sort of an act of recalcitrancy or like a resistance against like this Kemalist hegemony. These are like small examples, but then we see like even in the 50s, for instance, that as Özge also said, like that people use this script despite of the language reforms. Regarding the question, yes, the names like Weinberg, and there are like various, examples of, famous photo studios and also cinema owners, cinema producers that are very much connected to the non-Muslim communities, so both the Levantine and Jewish communities in particular. Your question is definitely right. So it does tell us something about who was making the pictures, but I'm not so sure about if it also gives us a lot of insight into for whom the pictures were being made, especially until the 1950s, because then, or 40s, 50s, because then the bulk of these this production was basically in the hands of these non-Muslim communities, and they had, in a sense, through tradition, practice, a hegemony on these professions. That is also, as you mentioned, most of these studios were based in Beyoğlu, and most of the residents, but until at that time, were still also of the non-Muslim Ottomans and later non-Muslim citizens of Turkey. So, and they were obviously also making photographs for ethnic Turks, nationalist Turks in that sense. But I think Özge is better equipped also to comment on the specificities of that particular part. Yeah.
Perhaps one last question, if yeah.
Thank you to you both. Enno, you probably were expecting a question from me. You know, I have a similar interest in these foreign institutes. I was curious also from Özge talking about these, this social mobility. Do you notice a pattern, a kind of social strategy in the presumably different elites of Istanbul, presumably also Nouveau Riche emerging? Do they choose different foreign references? You know, would some groups maybe prefer the German schools, whereas others would prefer, you know, would be more French-oriented? So, you know, do you see different social strategies in these orientations to different European groups?
Yeah.
I hope the question's clear.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. But yeah, I mean, for the clubs, it's a little bit different, and then for the schools, I would say, I mean, most of these foreign clubs, they operate at a very low-key level, so to speak, especially nowadays, but also into a certain extent in the 1980s, like Teutonia, which is one, well, you can guess by the name, the German club, is especially, I mean, is becoming basically an appendix of the National Socialist parties in the 1930s and 1940s, and through that it also becomes very hard for them to sustain a sort of neutral connection to West Germany in the 1950s. So they really struggle with this image of being a braunes Haus, or a brown house, so they're carrying this legacy of Nazism. Despite of that, I mean, there are still, you know, like what I call then Bosphorus Germans who frequent the club or use it for lunches or activities, but I mean, it is very much a German user profile and very much middle class, I would argue. I mean, like the times that it was sort of more of an elite environment is something that stretches back to maybe the 1910s or something. So that is already, you know, like probably even before the Second World War, more or less democratized. As regards for the Büyükulüp, for instance, there you definitely see it is effectively at first, you know, like a club that is only accessible for pashas, diplomats, statesmen, and so on and so forth. But in the, you know, like past, I'm not exactly sure when they made a decision, but let's say 4 decades, also indeed the Nouveau Riche has gained access to these clubs, and you know, like have a very strong presence in Büyükulüp. And the reason why I said it's different for the schools is because when we look at the period that I was focusing on, Turkey is really struggling at the level of secondary education, but also tertiary education with capacity. So, you know, like middle class, upper middle class bourgeoisie try to get their children into one of the, you know, like reputable schools which have some sort of a foreign connection or at least a foreign education. And they will subscribe their children, you know, to a variety of schools. So I'm sure, I mean, I could not find it, but I mean, there is a possibility that there is indeed such an issue that you hint at in your question, but in the period between the 50s and the 70s, there is such a strong lack of capacity. You also see it in the universities that people are basically happy that they get their kid into a reputable school at all, and whether it's then the English or the or Robert College or you know, like one of the French or Francophone schools, doesn't really matter that much to them. But it is, you know, like I mean, just to illustrate this, I mean, the prep classes of the German school in the 70s have maybe 90 spots. And close to 4,000 people apply to that. So that gives you an idea. I mean, and you need a lot of money. You needed a lot of money to actually get your child into that school. So, I mean, and really also like there are various examples of middle classes that really squeeze themselves, middle class families that really squeeze themselves to get their children into one of these schools. But it is, yeah, more capacity than language or reputation driven, I would say. Yeah.
Thanks, Enno. Thanks to Özge and Enno together. Again, congratulations on the wonderful books. Thanks, Luisa. And also a big thanks to the audience, and perhaps one last round of applause for the two authors.
Unfortunately, due to Brexit and other circumstances, we could not actually have, like a sufficient number of physical copies present for you to buy. But if you would like to buy one of the books, I mean, we have prepared order forms, and also if you would just like to browse through the book, please be our guest, and we will put the copies over there at the desk. And yeah, as I said, it's a discount price now, so today. So this is your chance. Yeah. Okay, thank you.